today for the Whitney Raincoat Sew Along, we are talking all about waterproofing those seams so that your raincoat is truly a raincoat and will keep all of that rain out of your jacket and will keep you nice and dry and keep all of that water out of your jacket. So we can make a raincoat in waterproof fabric, but that still does not make the raincoat entirely waterproof because, as you know, whenever we sew, we create little holes in the fabric with our needle. Granted, these holes are being filled with thread, but water can still tend to seep through. And that is why you may want to waterproof your raincoat. This is not a necessary step if you're making more of a soft shell type raincoat, or you generally plan on using an umbrella in addition to wearing your raincoat, or if you live in a climate where you get more of a light drizzle than a sudden downpour, you may not feel the need to completely waterproof your raincoat. But it is a fun step for completely reinforcing your raincoat and being able to protect your body from getting wet. So today I'm going to be covering two methods for waterproofing. One is a waterproofing seam sealing tape, and the other is a liquid-based seam sealer. So the first method I'm going to show you is a seam sealing tape. Now this particular brand is called Melcro Iron-On Seam Tape. This is 7/8 inches wide, and I got this from Seattle Fabrics. And this works by being ironed on to the inside of your jacket across the whole sewn seam. Now, what I love about this is how wide it is, because you can trim down your seam allowance, and once this is ironed on, that entire seam and seam allowance is encased inside this seam. This is also, that makes this a great method for an unlined jacket as well, because it kind of looks cool with all of the seams nice and sealed inside. This method, I think, creates a little more reliable of a seal because you can see that the entire seam is enclosed under the tape. However, this method is a little bit more finicky to deal with, and you want to be careful using this method on highly meltable fabrics. So if you are working with laminated fabrics or repurposing a shower curtain or any kind of plasticky feeling fabric, you really want to be careful about the heat level you are using, and definitely you will want to use a press cloth. So that is going to be method one. And method two is a water-based seam seal. This is Coglin's water-based seal, and this is what I've used on both of my personal raincoats. I like this method because it is much more quick and easy to apply, and it works great for those coated fabrics because the liquid seal just glides right onto them and soaks into the seam. One downside to this is that it can get a little messy, so you want to make sure you have a wet cloth nearby if you're using this method so that you can wipe your hands and you don't get any seal anywhere on the coat that you don't want it to be. Also, you do have to let this dry before you can move on to any other steps. So do be prepared to let your coat sit inside out over a chair or something for 1 or 2 coats before being able to move on to the next step. This stuff is great though because it has an applicator tip, so it goes on really easily. You're not fiddling around with getting a tape nice and smooth, and it's super quick to apply. So in this video, I'm going to show you how I used both of these methods for 2 different raincoats. I hope you enjoy. Okay, so for this seam tape technique, the first thing I like to do is trim down my seam allowance so that I know that my seam tape is covering both the seam, the stitching, but also sealing in this seam allowance gap as well that also has hole access. So, and this works well with this wider seam tape. I also wanted to show y'all this example on the hood piece because it is a little bit more finicky, and I am using a tailor's ham to really be able to get around the curves of the hood. This is the wrong side of the hood, and you always want to either do a test swatch. If you're unsure, you could use a press cloth, which I definitely recommend if you are using any kind of laminate fabric. I have tested my iron on this fabric and it works just fine. I have it on the silk setting. So I am still getting some steam, but it is a lower heat. And with your seam tape, you will be able to tell this lighter, shinier side is the side that goes down on the seam. The other side, you can just see the fabric. And as mentioned before, all of these products are linked in the description below. So I already did one side to sort of test it out before showing y'all. And I am just going to put the seam tape over the seam and iron it on just like I would a bit of interfacing. And I am just ironing down the seam, making sure the tape is straddling this seam perfectly and is centered. And you can see that it is starting to seal there. As I'm curving around this ham, I want to find a place that the hood sits with the most minimal puckers. And I'm just working around bit by bit. You can kind of tell once the seam tape is adhered, you can see the ridges of the seam underneath. And I am going to go over this once to get the tape held in place. And then once it is all sealed on, I like to go over it again to make sure that it is gonna stay put and keep any raindrops off of our head while we are wearing our raincoat. Again, just working around this seam. And when you get to the end, before you seal up to this point, go ahead and cut the tape to the desired length and then finish sealing. We don't want to waste any tape, and you don't want to accidentally seal to your tailor's ham. Now I'm just going back over all of the seams that I just sealed to make sure the tape is fully adhered to the seam, following the seam all the way back around to the other side. If you do have any spots that you feel are not quite sticking, like here, it wants to pucker up a little bit, you can always cut another piece of seam tape and just layer it on top, like so. So as you can see, it's pretty easy to apply. It is a little finicky getting around the curved edges of a hood, but with the rest of your straighter seams, you should have no problem. And now we have a hood that has water protection all around the seams. For part 2, I am going to show you how to seal it with a liquid seam sealer. This is the brand and type I am using. It's called Coglin's water-based seam seal. I will link it below. There are many similar ones to this. I like this one because it has a foam applicator tip, so it's really clean and easy to apply without making a big mess. And what we are going to do is I'm going to start with this center back seam here. It has been pressed open and it's very quick and easy. You just turn it upside down, apply pressure, and move this applicator up your seam. Now you can kind of see the glossy liquid there of the seam sealer. You want to make sure that it really gets in the cracks of the seam. And of course, I would recommend testing this on a swatch first. And it doesn't work quite as well. I have this backed with muslin because my fabric was pretty light. It doesn't work quite as well if you're using an absorbent fabric, but I'm still going to seal this pleat seam right here as well. So a plus side of using this type of seam sealer, as you can see, is that it is very quick and easy to apply. However, the downside is that you do have to wait for it to dry before continuing to sew. You can also choose to put on a second coat. I would make that decision after it dries, and you can kind of look and see if the sealer has really sunk in to the seams, and decide if you want to make a second coat. But I especially like this method for the coated or slicker fabrics, like what I'm using here is a nylon and a laminated cotton. So anything slick, I find it super easy to seal the seams this way because the sealer just glides right on into the seam there. And I also wanted to show quickly how this works in, for instance, where we have already top stitched. So I am going to seal the outside of the seam, and I also am going to pull this open and seal the inside as well. And on the softer, not slick fabrics, the sealer is just going to absorb into like the muslin, for instance, but it's also absorbing into those stitch lines, which is the most important part. I also recommend with this method that you have a wet cloth handy, because if you get this on your hands, it is kind of sticky and hard to do anything else with. And after I'm done, I am going to hang this coat up inside out on my dress form to let it dry. And that is how you use the liquid seam sealer. As always, if you have any additional questions, please let me know in the comments below. And do look for the rest of the videos as part of this sew along coming soon to this YouTube channel, so be sure to subscribe. Happy sewing!